Eric Dawson never thought he was capable. Subscribe channel CSS, Crime Story series of murder. Sarah Dawson never expected her perfect escape plan to crumble in a single night. Jake Miller never saw death coming, especially not at the hands of his best friend. What started as suspicion turned into rage. What should have been a confrontation became a crime, and by the time the night was over, one of them was dead, another was on the run, and the last was left standing in the middle of a nightmare far darker than anyone could have imagined. Eric Dawson had spent years building the life he always wanted. A steady job, a beautiful home, and a wife he loved. As a construction manager, he worked long hours, but it was worth it. He prided himself on being a provider, making sure Sarah had everything she needed. Their marriage wasn't perfect, no relationship was, but he had always believed in their commitment to each other. Sarah had been his partner for a decade, the person he trusted most. She was smart, independent, and carried herself with an effortless charm. In the early years, they had spent weekends traveling, trying new restaurants, and making plans for the future. Lately, though, something had changed. Sarah had become distant. Her once affectionate nature had faded, replaced by cold indifference. Conversations were shorter, laughter was rare, and her phone was always in her hand, screen tilted away from him. At first, Eric ignored it. People changed over time, and marriage had its ups and downs. Maybe she was just stressed, maybe work was overwhelming her. She had mentioned feeling exhausted, that her boss at the accounting firm had been piling on extra tasks. It made sense, or at least that's what Eric told himself, but there were other signs. She had started dressing differently, putting more effort into her appearance. On nights she claimed to be working late, expensive perfumes lingered in the house. Scents he didn't recognize. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always locked and tucked away. When Eric asked what was wrong, she dismissed his concerns with a tired smile, saying he was imagining things. Then there was Jake, Eric's best friend since college. Jake had always been the life of the party, charismatic, smooth-talking, and effortlessly likable. He was the kind of guy everyone gravitated toward. They had been through everything together: bad breakups, job losses, and drunken nights that turned into lifelong stories. But Jake had been acting strange too. He avoided Eric more than usual, dodging plans and answering calls with vague excuses. When they did see each other, there was a stiffness between them, an awkwardness that hadn't been there before. A sinking feeling took root in Eric's gut. Something wasn't right. He just didn't know how bad it really was. Not yet. Eric couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in his gut, no matter how much he tried to convince himself that everything was fine. The doubts kept creeping in. Sarah's behavior wasn't just different, it was calculated. She was keeping secrets, and no matter how much he wanted to trust her, the evidence was piling up. She was spending more nights at work, even though she had never needed to before. When he asked why, she gave vague answers, things about new clients, last-minute reports, extra hours to help the company. But when Eric called her office one evening just to check in, one of her coworkers casually mentioned that Sarah had left hours ago. He didn't say anything to her about it that night, but the line gnawed at him. Then there were the unexplained charges on their bank statements. Eric rarely looked through their finances. Sarah handled most of the bills and savings, but one evening as he was reviewing some paperwork, he noticed odd transactions, fancy restaurants he had never been to, hotel bookings in the city, expensive purchases that didn't match their usual spending habits. When he asked Sarah about them, she brushed it off, saying she had been meeting clients or shopping with friends. But Eric knew better. Sarah never spent money carelessly. His thoughts kept drifting back to Jake. His best friend had become distant, dodging phone calls, always too busy to grab a drink after work. When They did talk. Jake seemed uneasy, avoiding eye contact, fidgeting with his hands. It wasn't like him. Jake had always been confident, the kind of guy who carried himself with effortless charm, but lately there was tension in the air. Whenever they were in the same room, Eric tried to ignore it. He wanted to believe that he was being paranoid, that stress from work was making him overthink, but deep down he knew better. The pieces weren't adding up, and the people he trusted most were the ones making him question everything. He had to find out the truth. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when every instinct in his body was screaming that it wasn't. He just didn't realize how much the truth would cost him. It was supposed to be a normal night. Eric had been scheduled to work late, overseeing a project that was running behind, but a sudden change in plans allowed him to leave early. As he drove home, he thought about picking up dinner for Sarah, a small gesture to reconnect after the growing distance between them. Maybe he had been too suspicious, maybe he was overanalyzing things that had simple explanations. He wanted to believe that, but as he pulled into the driveway, his stomach tightened. Jake's car was parked in front of his house. His best friend, who had been avoiding him for weeks, was here while Sarah thought Eric was still at work. Every warning sign, every strange feeling came rushing back in an instant. The missed calls, the awkward conversations, the suspicious spending. It all led to this moment. Eric sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Maybe there was an explanation, maybe he was jumping to conclusions, but deep down he already knew what he was about to find. He opened the door and stepped out, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, moving toward the house. He tried to stay calm, but his hands trembled as he reached for the front door. It was unlocked. Slowly he pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. The soft glow of the bedroom light spilled into the hallway, and he heard faint whispers followed by a breathless laugh. Sarah's laugh. Something inside him snapped. He moved forward, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the bedroom door, he pushed it open with force. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Sarah and Jake were tangled together in bed, their faces frozen in shock as they turned to face him. Eric's vision blurred with rage. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. His wife, his best friend, the two people he trusted most, had been lying to him, deceiving him, humiliating him in his own home. The weight of their betrayal crushed him, and in that moment nothing else existed. His hands clenched into fists, his entire body burned with fury. He didn't think, he only acted, and in the next few moments everything changed forever. Time slowed, a red haze clouded Eric's vision, his pulse hammering in his ears. The world around him faded. There was only the betrayal, the suffocating weight of it pressing down on his chest. Sarah scrambled off the bed, eyes wide with shock and fear. Jake stammered something, hands raised in defense, but Eric didn't hear a word. The anger inside him boiled over, an unstoppable force consuming every rational thought. Before he knew it, he was moving. He lunged at Jake, grabbing him by the throat and driving him backward. The two men crashed into the dresser, knocking over a lamp, sending glass shattering across the floor. Jake fought back, shoving Eric hard, but Eric barely felt it. Years of hard labor had built his strength, and Jake, despite his charm and confidence, had never been a fighter. Sarah screamed, her voice distant, muffled by the roaring fury in Eric's mind. Jake twisted in Eric's grip, gasping for air, struggling to push him away, but Eric wasn't letting go. He had trusted this man, shared years of friendship with him, and all the while Jake had been sneaking around with Sarah, laughing behind his back, betraying him in the worst way possible. The rage inside Eric only grew stronger. His fist shot out, connecting with Jake's jaw, sending him stumbling against the Nightstand. The impact knocked over a framed wedding photo. Eric and Sarah smiling on their wedding day. The glass cracked as it hit the ground. The symbolism of it only fueled Eric's fury. Jake tried to run, but Eric grabbed him again, throwing him onto the bed. He climbed on top of him, fists landing blow after blow, each one fueled by heartbreak and rage. Jake grunted in pain, arms flailing, trying to block the punches. Sarah grabbed at Eric's arm, screaming at him to stop, but he shoved her away without thinking, and then it happened. In the chaos, Jake's head struck the corner of the nightstand with a sickening crack. His body jerked once, then went still. The room was suddenly silent except for Sarah's panicked breathing. Eric stared down at his best friend, his hands still clenched into fists, his chest heaving, the rage drained away, replaced by something colder. Jake wasn't moving. Eric staggered back, his own breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His hands were covered in blood. The realization hit him like a freight train. In one uncontrolled moment, he had done something he could never take back. The room felt suffocating. Eric's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at Jake's unmoving body. The once lively, confident man who had been his best friend was now nothing more than a lifeless form sprawled across the bedroom floor. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and spreading fast. Eric couldn't look away. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his body refused to obey. Sarah was the first to react. She stumbled backward against the wall, her face pale, her hands trembling, her lips parted as if she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She looked at Eric, eyes full of horror, as if he were some kind of monster. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't meant for this to happen, that he had just lost control, but the words stuck in his throat. Then she moved, fumbling, panicked. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, her fingers struggling to unlock it. Eric snapped out of his trance. His instincts kicked in. He couldn't let her call the police. If she did, it was over. Everything, his life, his career, his freedom. Without thinking, he lunged forward and ripped the phone from her grasp, throwing it across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. Sarah gasped, stepping back as if she expected him to attack her next. Please, her eyes pleaded silently, though no words escaped her lips. Eric wasn't sure if she was begging for her life or for him to fix this mess. Either way, he had no answers. His thoughts raced. He had to leave. Staying here wasn't an option. The neighbors might have heard something. If the police showed up, they wouldn't care about the betrayal or his rage. They would only see a dead body and a guilty man. Eric turned on his heel and stumbled out of the bedroom. His heart pounded as he rushed through the house, barely aware of Sarah following a few steps behind him, her breathing still sharp and uneven. He grabbed his truck keys from the counter, his mind a blur. He had no plan, no destination, only the crushing realization that his life had just changed forever. Without another glance at Sarah or the man he had once called his best friend, Eric threw open the front door, stepped into the cold night air and ran. The house was silent except for Sarah's ragged breathing. She stood frozen, staring at the spot where Jake's lifeless body lay. The blood, dark against the cream-colored carpet, looked unreal, like something from a nightmare. Her hands trembled violently as she pressed them against her mouth, trying to stop the scream rising in her throat. Eric was gone. She had heard his truck roar to life, the tires screeching against the pavement as he sped away. He had left her alone with the mess, the consequences, the weight of everything that had just happened. Part of her wanted to collapse, to curl into a ball and sob, but another part of her, one that had always been calculating, always thinking. Her head knew she didn't have time for that. She needed a plan. Her mind was racing. She could call the police, tell them Eric had killed Jake in a fit of rage. That was the truth, but what would happen when they started digging deeper? What would they find? Sarah knew that Jake's death wasn't the only secret Hidden inside these walls, if the police started investigating, they wouldn't just uncover Eric's crime, they would uncover hers too. Her eyes darted toward her purse where a stack of forged bank documents lay hidden, the stolen money, the missing funds from her company. She had planned everything so carefully. Jake had been helping her, laundering the money through small transactions, moving it piece by piece until they had enough to disappear and start over. She had never planned on staying with Eric forever. He was supposed to be a stepping stone, a provider, until she could leave with enough to live comfortably. But now Jake was dead and Eric was on the run. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to think clearly. She moved quickly, grabbing cleaning supplies from under the sink. It was a useless effort. There was too much blood, too much evidence, but she needed to do something, anything. Every second that passed felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the moment everything fell apart. Then a sharp knock at the front door made her freeze. Her heart nearly stopped. Had the neighbors heard the fight? Had someone already called the police? She stood still, barely breathing, as another knock echoed through the house. Sarah knew one thing for certain: the nightmare was only beginning. The knock came again, louder. This time Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to stay still, to pretend no one was home. But the blood-stained carpet and the lifeless body just feet away told her that time was running out. Whoever was at the door wasn't going away. Forcing herself to move, she wiped her trembling hands on her dress and made her way to the front door. She hesitated before opening it, schooling her face into the most neutral expression she could manage. When she finally pulled it open, she found herself staring at their next door neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, a sweet but nosy woman in her late 60s. "I heard shouting," the older woman said, peering past Sarah into the dimly lit house. "Is everything all right?" Sarah forced a weak smile, gripping the doorframe to keep her hands from shaking. "Oh yes, everything's fine," she said, a voice barely above a whisper. "Eric and I had a little argument, but it's nothing serious." Mrs. Grayson's sharp eyes studied her. "Are you sure?" It sounded intense. Sarah nodded quickly. "Just a bad night, really. I appreciate you checking, but I'm fine." The older woman hesitated before finally offering a small nod. "All right, dear, but if you need anything, you know where to find me." As soon as the door shut, Sarah exhaled shakily, pressing her forehead against the wood. She had dodged one bullet, but she knew there would be more. If Mrs. Grayson had heard the fight, there was a chance other neighbors had too. How long before someone else came knocking? How long before the police showed up? She turned back toward the bedroom, her stomach churning at the sight of Jake's body. The smell of blood was beginning to hang in the air, heavy and metallic. She couldn't stay here. The longer she remained, the greater the chance of getting caught. But where could she go? Eric was out there somewhere, running, but he had no idea that his crime wasn't the only one waiting to be discovered, because the investigation wouldn't just reveal Jake's murder, it would uncover Sarah's financial crimes, the embezzlement, the fraudulent transfers, the plan she and Jake had carefully crafted. And if that happened, she wouldn't just be a grieving wife, she would be a suspect too. Eric drove aimlessly through the dark, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was a blur, racing between panic and disbelief. He had killed Jake, his best friend. The realization kept crashing over him in waves, each one heavier than the last. He could still feel the weight of the moment, the fury that had blinded him, the sickening crack of bone against wood. How did it come to this? He had spent his whole life working hard, doing things the right way. He wasn't the kind of man who got into fights, let alone killed someone. But in one uncontrollable moment he had destroyed everything. His marriage was already falling apart, but now his entire life was ruined. There was no way to fix this. The truck's headlights cut through The empty road ahead, but Eric barely saw it. His thoughts kept spinning back to Sarah, how she had looked at him after it happened, as if she didn't recognize him. As if he was a monster. Maybe he was. He pulled off onto a deserted side road. Finally letting himself breathe, his hands shook as he ran them through his hair. He needed to think. What were his options? Turning himself in wasn't one of them. He knew what would happen if he did. No one would care that it had been a crime of passion, a moment of blind rage. They would only see the evidence, the body, the blood. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but running wasn't much better. Where would he go? He had no plan, no money, nothing but the clothes on his back and the guilt weighing him down. Then another thought crept in, one that made his stomach twist. What if Sarah didn't keep quiet? What if she told the police everything? She had been there, she had seen it happen, and she had every reason to protect herself. Eric had always believed Sarah was loyal, but now he wasn't so sure. A cold realization settled over him. If he wanted to survive this, he had to act first. He couldn't just sit here and wait for the police to come knocking. He needed to go back to Sarah before she made a choice that would seal his fate. CSS Crime Story Series.